start with Elizabeth Kneebone from the Brookings Institution, author of Confronting Suburban Poverty, because I think before we start this conversation, we got to know what we're talking about here. So what does this even mean? What does suburban poverty mean to you?
Well, this is something we've been studying over the last several years in our nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas. And it's not something we expected or necessarily set out to study initially. We were interested in, my colleague Alan Berube and I at Brookings, in looking at how poverty was shifting across cities and suburbs in our major metro areas, particularly by the mid-2000s. We know we'd come through a recession. We had this new data source that was letting us look at local level poverty trends in mid-decade for the first time. So we wanted to see what the new picture was, how things had changed. And in looking at the data, we found, surprisingly, for the first time, that there were more poor residents living in suburbs than in the major cities that anchored these large metropolitan areas.
Is this the effect of the recession, or does this trend go back even earlier?
It goes back even before then. Clearly, the Great Recession really pushed fast forward on these trends, as we saw poverty growing to record levels across the country. But if we look back even to the 80s, that's really the first time we saw the poor population in suburbs start to grow at a faster pace than cities. And it's something that just picked up pace each decade until we passed this tipping point in the 2000s.
So back up for a second. You said there are now more poor people in our suburbs than in our urban cores.
That's right.
What kind of reaction do you get to that when you say suburban poverty and you say it's higher than the cities?
It's surprising, I think, to a lot of people in a lot of places. In a lot of ways, our perceptions haven't really kept up with the rapid changes we've seen in recent years, where poverty is, who it's affecting. I mean, between 2000 and 2012, the poor population in the suburbs of our major metros grew by 65%. And that's more than twice the pace of growth that happened in the large cities in those regions. And by 2012, there were 3 million more poor in suburbs than in large cities in those regions.
Before we get to the why, tell me more about the what. What is this poverty? What does it look like in the suburbs?
In a lot of ways, urban and suburban poverty are really similar in terms of things like the share of people living in deep poverty or below half the poverty line, in terms of things like work effort, the share foreign-born. A lot of the demographic characteristics are very similar. Where we see bigger differences are things like race and ethnicity, and home ownership seems to be higher in the suburbs. But by and large, very similar types of characteristics across cities and suburbs.
Okay, so what are our stereotypes of poverty, and then how has that evolved, or maybe devolved, I guess?
Well, I think in a lot of ways we still tend to think as a nation of poverty as a very urban or a very rural phenomenon. We don't really think of suburbs as grappling with these same sorts of challenges. And in some ways that makes it difficult to effectively address these issues in places that often these increases have been very rapid in recent years, and they're not really equipped or necessarily set up to address these challenges in the same ways that cities have been building up infrastructure and support systems to deal with poverty over several decades.
Okay, why? Why is this happening?
Well, there are a number of different factors that have helped drive these trends over time. Speaking broadly, we could think of poverty growing in the suburbs, one, because more low-income residents are moving there, but even more so, it's been a story about long-term residents slipping down the economic ladder over time. We can see things in terms of what might draw people to the suburbs, or what would draw anybody to the suburbs if you're looking for housing or jobs. Almost every major metro area, we've seen jobs continue to suburbanize. So there are a lot of pull factors in suburban communities. But we've also seen changes to the economy that are helping to drive these numbers. One, of course, the recession. In a lot of ways, it was a really housing-led downturn. And when we look at where the bulk of subprime loans were, where the bulk of foreclosures were, those were in suburban communities across the country. And so the suburbs bore the brunt of the downturn alongside cities more so than they have in past downturns. But it's not just those cyclical changes, because we've also seen a lot of structural shifts over several years, over a long period of time, in terms of the diminishing of middle wage jobs, like think of the loss of manufacturing jobs. And now the kinds of jobs that we're growing fastest are often in occupations that pay lower wages, and maybe wouldn't even be enough to get a family working full-time above the poverty line. A lot of those jobs are in suburban communities, and a lot of people who work in those jobs live in the suburbs.
Okay, you literally wrote the book on this topic. Normally, when we're fortunate enough to have someone with your level of expertise, we're talking to you via Google Hangout. Tell us why you're in St. Louis.
Well, so the book my colleague Alan Berube and I released last year, it was actually May 20th last year, and it turns out that the County of St. Louis and their planning department saw the webcast, the release of the book, and got in touch with me at that time, shortly after that release, and talked about how could we come out here and have this conversation in this region. So it's something we've been working on over several months to try and bring people together to talk about how these shifts and trends are playing out in this region. What does it mean for residents and communities affected by these trends, and how can people start thinking about different or new ways to work together to grapple with these challenges?
What should we infer if St. Louis County picked up the phone and called you about this topic?
Well, I mean, this is something that county has been seeing play out for years. There are almost 120,000 poor people in St. Louis County. That's more than in the city of St. Louis. It's the highest poor population in the metropolitan area. They saw poverty grow by almost 75% in just 12 years. So this is something that's very real to this county and that they see playing out in all kinds of communities across the county. So I think it's something that they were aware of and trying to build this broader conversation around for how do we really start thinking about strategies and solutions.
Okay, so give us be our reporter, if you would, for today's event. This was today that you were meeting with folks, correct?
That's right.
What was that discussion like? What was learned or shared?
Well, I think a number of different takeaways for me anyway, especially coming from Washington, D.C., sitting here hearing the local community talk about these trends is, one, there's a lot of need. You know, one challenge that I think a lot of suburban communities face is not always having, like we talked about, that capacity in place from the safety net and services perspective to grapple with these challenges. There are often transportation challenges in suburban communities. How do you get people connected to jobs and services if they don't have public transit or if they don't have a car? I think these are real challenges. I think we also heard some really promising conversation and discussions about the solutions and more innovative things that are happening, which I know we'll get to talk about a little bit more in this program, about communities working together in a more collective, comprehensive way to help address some of these challenges.
Okay, so if you're living in poverty in St. Louis County, any of our other suburbs, are you poor on money, or are you also poor on other things? Is your emotional health? Are these factors that you're looking at as well? Maybe your physical health. Do those tie in together?
I think there are a lot of intersections there, and it's also a really important reminder as we talk about suburban poverty. I mean, we often tend to think about suburbs or talk about suburbs like they're one thing. But really, they're a collection of very diverse communities that have differing levels of capacity, that have different opportunities available to their residents. So the experience of poverty is really going to vary depending on where you live. I think one thing that's especially concerning in seeing the rapid growth in suburban poverty is that it's not just about poverty spreading out in regions, it's also concentrating at the same time. So that's something we often think about a lot in cities, is concentrated poverty, which is being poor in a very poor neighborhood. And that can bring a whole host of additional challenges with it. And that's something we're increasingly seeing in the suburbs. In the St. Louis region, about 27% of poor residents live in the suburbs, live in a neighborhood that has a poverty rate of 20% or more. And that's about when we start to see these negative effects of concentrated poverty grow. And it's even more so, more pronounced when you're looking at residents of color. For the African American population, almost half of poor Black residents in the suburbs live in a high poverty neighborhood. And that's when we definitely see the negative effects in terms of health outcomes, education outcomes, mental well-being can all be impacted by the fact that you're poor, and so is everyone around you. That can, again, just bring a number of challenges that can make it that much harder to work your way out of poverty.
Elizabeth.